world where magic has faded into legend and an empire seeks to reclaim its power. But when a young woman with mysterious powers breaks free from their control, fate begins to weave an unlikely rebellion. A band of friends, a thief, a king, a knight, an assassin, an artist, an engineer, and more. This is their story, Final Fantasy VI, and it's truly, truly beautiful. This is also beautiful, in very, very different ways. So this is Octopath Traveler, and I'll always remember the first time I looked at it and thought, I think pixel art has peaked. I believe the term is HD 2D, and typically what that looks like is you get an older style of pixel art, kind of reimagined with depth and actual 3D models for larger objects. And in Octopath's case, it seems to kind of keep the pixel arty textures, and that's exactly what I'm going to be doing. I've always been so impressed with how this style has been presented, hoped that other games pick it up, and always wondered what older games would look like if they had this. And I guess if the title isn't enough of a spoiler, I'm going to attempt to try to do that with Final Fantasy VI. I'm going to be using all of the original assets from that game, so we probably won't hit the level of detail that Octopath has, but I'm hoping it just kind of looks authentic in its own vintage way, I guess. And more specifically, I'm going to be focusing on the opening of the game, so the area for this project will be the mountain town Narshe. So with all that being said, I figured this time it would be a good opportunity for me to move away from Pro Builder and use an actual modeling software like Blender. I figured that because it was probably a good time to move away from built-in Unity prototyping tools. There's nothing wrong with Pro Builder, but you can't quite get as extensive as using something like this. So anyways, once I got more familiar with the software, I spent time modeling, and modeling, and more modeling, because that's just what Narshe requires. It's a village with a bunch of very bespoke shaped buildings. And once I was finally done modeling and I could move on to the next step, which was texturing these buildings to actually look like they belong there, I was pretty excited. Surely that won't be a problem. So I spent a little bit longer than I would like to admit trying to figure out how to texture a 3D model with a tile palette that you usually paint onto 2D environments. Long story short, I didn't figure it out. It's terrible, and I don't think you can. I'll get back to that in a bit, but what I decided to do next was sculpt the terrain for our environment. The opening of Final Fantasy VI is a town that's sort of in the mountains, so I used a sculpting plugin in Blender and just modeled out this little valley. Once that was all finished, we needed to put some rocky, snowy, mountainy textures onto our terrain. Blender and a lot of other softwares offer this feature called a shader graph, where you can take a bunch of different textures like rocks and snow and ground and whatever you really want to mix together, and you can play around with them and modify them using these nodes at the bottom. The idea here is just to get a rocky base and then to get snow layered on top as if it would have fallen normally. What you end up doing there is you have your base texture, like you can see the rocks here, and the tool will allow you to paint on a mask that would represent the other texture, which in this case would be the snow. So this is kind of the end result you get when you blend a few of these textures together. These are all from the original version of Final Fantasy VI, so you've got the rock and the snow that you saw before, and then the last one that's layered over the bottom is just a kind of a town floor carved stone, if you will. Yeah, so do you remember these? Yeah, I can't use any of them.
Watch this! You watching?
I'm not going to bore you with every single detail, but I had massive, and I mean months long trouble trying to get these exact textures onto 3D models that I made in Blender. Now, to be fair, that was mostly because of the method that I was dead set on using. Technically, I could have manually painted every single building, trying my best to copy the original art, but that was never really an option to me because that just sounds terrible. In my head, I always wanted to use a tile palette from the original Final Fantasy VI. And that's how I found this tool called Crocodile 3D, which let me do exactly that. There might be a way to do this in Blender or other things that I just completely missed, so please let me know if there was, and I'll just cry in my closet for a little bit. If you don't know what a tile palette is, it's basically a really handy tool that lets you pick existing pieces of art and paint them onto models, or even build the models themselves with them. It's a tool that has been used to make levels in 2D games, art for pixel art games, and many other things. And that's exactly what I needed for this project, because there's no way I could have just redrawn all of this stuff. After spending many evenings pretending to be an artist, I decided it was time to get the star of our show going, Terra. Most of you probably know that FF6 doesn't really have a true protagonist, but I still chose Terra because she is the first one you're introduced to in the game, and I just like her character. So finally, a relatively easy part of the project. All Terra needs in this context is to be able to walk around town and to be animated. So all I needed to do for that was find a sprite sheet, slice it all up, and then use those frames to make some very simple tiny walking animations. Next, I whipped up a player controller to get Terra moving around in the 3D space. I've done this so many times that I mostly was just copying logic from character controllers from other projects, but I did have to make a few tweaks to get it to work correctly in this context. And then once you make a bunch of animations and a character controller, but you don't link them up together, this is pretty much what you get. You just get a looping single animation and a character that's just sliding around everywhere like they're skating. I guess it's kind of thematic. But how do you make it work correctly? Easy, you can use a blend tree. What this blend tree does is it lets me take any animations that I made and it lets me map them onto this chart in the top right here. So since those animations are laid out on a 2D space, they each have an X and Y coordinate. And then you can take keyboard or controller movement, whether you're moving left, right, up or down on a joystick or WASD, you can take those inputs and map those to the same X and Y coordinates, and the tree will choose the correct animation based on the direction that you're moving. And this is the result of that blend tree. You have a character controller that moves around in 3D space, and the animations line up correctly. So now Terra looks like she's actually walking. And then just to cap off this player movement section, I did add a smooth following camera, so I think that's Octopath-y. I honestly don't remember, I just figure it is because everything in Octopath is smooth. I think building out the inside of the inns and the shops and the homes is when this project really started to come to life. Crocodile's really good at building out any 3D model with pixel art, but I think with these inside kind of dioramas it really shines. As you might expect by now, I spent lots of time making sure that these are as close to the originals as I could get. You also might be thinking that they look a little bit empty, and you're right. Instead of just using flat tiles for these objects, I decided to build them out in 3D just like I did with the buildings. So you've got your crates, your tables, your chairs, your beds, everything that you'd see in game. And that way I can get the 2D mixed with 3D effect that Octopath does with inside of its buildings. Little tiny objects are usually fully flat, but bigger things like tables and desks and counters are 3D. So next is the level building, which in the past has been kind of but no pro builder this time, so just the great crocodile buildings and the terrain that I made. So this part required a lot of patience. It was a lot of trial and error and placing things down and moving them and resizing and planning and just other things like that. I don't really do this kind of design in my projects or at work, so it was a good exercise in figuring this all out and trying to get as close to the OG as possible, which was extremely challenging at times because this has an entirely different dimension. So, and yeah, after a couple more hours of that, I got sort of a general layout here. Still pretty rough because I got snow and props and other things to add around the buildings to make it look more, I guess, lived in, but yeah. So that mostly included things like these giant brick walls and adding snow and stuff to them and making all of the scaffolding that you see around Narshe and the barrels and the outdoor furnaces and the stone piles and yeah, just things that make it look like an actual town and not a fake model of a town. I guess this is a model, but you know what I mean. I also decided to add a brand new object to this version of Narshe that's not in the original. It's a lantern, and I ended up putting it in a lot of different places. You might think, what's the point of a lantern for this map? It's daytime and it's not really going to add much effect. Well... This was definitely one of the boss battles of the project. I didn't really know anything about lighting in Unity when I started this, and it took me a long time to figure it out. One of the twists I wanted to add was I wanted this version of Narshe to be at night. It's kind of ambiguous what it is in Final Fantasy VI, but because I wanted to mess around with the lighting and make it look really cool, I decided to make it nighttime. And now you know that's why I made the lanterns. They're going to play a huge part in lighting up the town, and we'll see how it looks. So yeah, this is the kind of the first go of nighttime. Pretty uninspiring and not really lit up like I eventually got it to be, but you got to start somewhere. Yeah, so I don't want to bore you with the crazy technical details on this, but basically in Unity there are two types of lights. There's baked and real-time lights, and how you configure your level with both of those makes a massive difference. Getting the lighting right for this kind of environment was so much trial and error and such a massive learning curve. I honestly don't really know how I can begin to describe it from start to end in a way that doesn't make me sound like I'm insane. So, I guess here's how it happened. I tried to place all of the light in the level in the form of these lanterns and obviously the overhead light that comes from like the skybox. What I didn't know was that Unity has some pretty hefty restrictions on how many real-time lights you're allowed to have. Real-time lights being ones that interact with other objects dynamically, so if your character walks past them, they cast a shadow. If something else moves past them, the light will interact and shine on it and reflect off of other objects and things like that. You can only have a very limited count of those kind of lights shining on each object. I think it's like 6 or 7 or something like that. Which you might think, oh wow, that's actually a lot. You can just put 6 of those lights around every object. But depending on how far you want your light to shine and how big the bloom's going to be, it gets really, really, really tough to figure out where to put things. And even if you think that you have everything in the right spot, even if you are over that count per object by just one light, that light will just deactivate and it won't shine on that object. So I had to do a lot of moving things around and a lot of different configurations to get this to work. But in the end, I did end up figuring most of it out. And the way it turned out, without any fancy solutions or any post-processing yet, I think it lights up like a perfect little mountain town, and I was pretty happy with what it looked like at this stage. This is not even close to done yet. Well, it's close to done, but what you see here is not what it looks like now, and right now it looks pretty damn good. With the lighting taken care of, to me another really important part of getting this presentation on point and Octopathy is the transitions. And that just means how it looks when you walk in and outside of a building. In Octopath, the transition is completely seamless. It's like that inside of the building is actually there. There's no scene transition pause, there's no real loading time. This is an extremely hard thing to pull off and do it well, but it's what I wanted to do, so I had to figure it out for this. In Unity, the default way the scenes are set up is that they're kind of completely separate entities. It's set up that way because it makes loading other things and your character and logic really easy. It's all encapsulated in separate levels and things don't get mixed up. But to achieve that really smooth transition with no load times when you enter and leave a building, you have to do something completely different, and it took a lot of programming to get it to work right. And that's mostly because there are certain objects that need to be transitioned over to each scene back and forth that need to live forever. That's not really something that you necessarily have to do if the scenes are separate, but if you want them to be loaded together and carry logic over and stuff like that, it kind of can become a mess if you don't do it right. So now if I did this right, you'll see that Terra will transition right... I probably walked Terra into the void like that over 100 times, but after I figured out these transitions, you basically get a difference from this in the original to very snappy and instant like this, very modern. And if you compare the clip I just showed from the original to what we have here, we're starting to get something that looks very much like an actual remaster. Oh man, and I also completely forgot to mention that as a part of this more modern approach, I added this feature where if you walk behind buildings or if anything's in front of you while you're moving around, that object in front of Terra will just fade so you can see your character behind the object. It turned out pretty well, but that's an entirely other massive can of worms that I probably just won't get into. It was just a lot more programming and a lot more YouTube about shaders and stuff that I don't actually understand, so yeah, tough to talk about it. Well, we're approaching the end of this journey, and I gotta say I think this ended up turning out pretty well. We just have to add some finishing touches like snow and just probably way too much post-processing. Octopath loves their post-processing and bright lights and vignettes and blur and all that stuff, so we'll add that on and we'll wrap it up. So, like I said, as you can see, I'm just adding a giant particle effect volume to the entire village that's going to drop little white particles and make it look like it's snowing. Really not much else to say about this one, it's just a massive rectangle that drops random white particles. Had to configure it and tweak it a little bit, but yeah, this part was pretty easy. And so, here's what the project looks like in its final state without any post-processing, aside from the transition blur I have when you enter and leave a building. Not too shabby, but just wait until you see what a couple of camera effects and blurs and things like that can add. All you really need to do is add some bloom so your lights kind of pop a bit more. You want to add an overall tint to your lens, whether it's going to be cold or warm. It's kind of dependent on the environment and the vibe that you're going for. In this case, I kind of made it a little bit warmer. You also want to add some depth of field, so if you notice, the light beside Terra on the left there is pretty visible, and then if you look back at the lights further into the city, they're blurry. So farther away things will blur out, closer things to the camera are more focused. And then finally, I actually just added a point light to Terra herself, so that's why she kind of glows on her own. This is what Octopath does, and it kind of helps highlight your character. So all I did next was add Narsh's music, and here it is. Final Fantasy VI if it looked like Octopath. The town's a little bit empty, but this definitely gets the point across, and we'll see if we want to go further with this. As you know, the scope of this project was mostly just to show what it would be like to move around in a world like this. It would definitely be a very interesting part 2 to maybe dig into a battle system, or even just talking to other characters, conversations, sounds, things like that. Well, and there you have it. Thanks for getting to the end of this video, and If you appreciate this kind of content, please consider liking the video and just sharing it with your friends or family and subscribing to this channel, because that's what I do here. Yeah, I've never really been good at outros, I guess. Oh yeah, leave a comment and let me know if there is anything that you didn't like or that you did like, or if you have any questions. I'm always happy to answer questions about game development and design or have conversations about that. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon.